Police in Bahrain have fired tear gas and stun grenades at protesters trying to occupy a landmark square in the nation's capital. It happened on the eve of the one-year anniversary of a pro-democracy uprising in the Gulf Kingdom. On Monday, hundreds of protesters marched through Manama to mark the revolt that was crushed by security forces. Well, let's now talk more about this with Middle East expert Tariq Ali, who joins us now live via broadband from London. Thank you for being with us. Bahrain's opposition accused police of brutal tactics in suppressing protests that flared up last February, and yet we hear no words of condemnation from countries that so vehemently support uprisings in Syria and Libya, not to mention almost no media coverage of it. Why is that?
Well, the reason for that is very simple, that most of the Western media and those who provide it with instructions on a daily and weekly basis live by double standards. So those countries which are regarded as allies of the West or stooges of the West are basically not criticized regularly. Very rarely do we have coverage. It's not just the Gulf states or Bahrain in particular. It is also countries like Yemen, whose brutal dictatorial former president is currently in the United States receiving medical treatment, and no reporting is taking place from the Yemen. There were demonstrations in Saudi Arabia a few days ago which got very little coverage. So this is normal. We have come to expect it.
But Saudi Arabia has also helped the ruling family in Bahrain to stop the violence in the country. Now Saudi Arabia is actively backing rebels fighting against the Syrian regime. What is the Saudi agenda here?
There is no independent Saudi agenda. They may be slightly autonomous, but not too much. Essentially, they are a surrogate for the United States in the region. They always have been, and they remain so. And both they and Qatar are now competing with each other as to who can satisfy the West more, given the collapse of Mubarak in Egypt. And the Saudis intervened. Their intervention in Bahrain was green-lighted by the United States, which is very strong in that principality, and they crushed the uprising. And there were brutalities, untold brutalities, which are dealt with in a different way. And now we have a situation where the chief advisor to the Bahraini police is the former chief of police in Philadelphia and in Florida, whose record in those two parts of the United States wasn't very good. He's now giving them advice on how to crush and brutalize the demonstrators, and he says they're doing it largely because these demonstrators create traffic problems. The problem in Bahrain is not a traffic problem. It is a problem that 70 to 80% of the population feels it has no representation whatsoever. And yet, nothing happens on this front at all.
Right, and also it's Saudi Arabia and Qatar that are putting forward that resolution at the UN General Assembly today. But let's leave that aside and talk more about Saudi Arabia itself. Of course, you mentioning this having a very poor human rights record, and it's clearly not a democracy. So what kind of moral authority does it have to tell other Middle Eastern governments to step down?
It has no moral authority at all. It has financial authority in the sense that it sits on large quantities of oil on which the West is dependent, and the West prefers a Saudi regime which is pliant and pliable, and that means this a corrupt family that has straddled over the country now for a long, long time, and which will not move unless there's an upheaval from below. Of course, the Saudis have no democracy at all. It is probably the most undemocratic country in the entire Arab world. And yet, it's accepted. Much, much more undemocratic even than Libya was. No one talks about this because it's a useful country. It has oil and it does what the West asked. And do not imagine that what the Saudis and Qataris are doing is of their own accord. They are essentially talking behind the scenes regularly with the United States and probably some of the EU countries, and who knows, even Israel, because the big attempt now is to try and isolate Iran and effectively destroy it as a major power in the region. That is what is being discussed behind the scene. Syria is part and parcel of that game.
Why don't don't you think we hear more about the double standards from critics, from experts, as you like it, anyone? We hear so little about the double standards in terms of the U.S. backing the opposition in countries like Syria, Libya, Egypt, but then supporting the government when it comes to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think that essentially what has been going on is that since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union and that whole world, the Western media has become a central pillar of government policies. And if you look at Pentagon documents and papers, they say that when we fight a war, the media and control of the media is an extremely important element, which is why you see that in the case of Al Jazeera, which for a long time was pretty independent and not affected by government propaganda, has now become a government propaganda station where Qatari and Saudi interests are concerned. They back the Libyan war, they effectively project the government line. There's very little criticism of what their own government is doing, and in that they've become virtually the replica now of CNN and BBC World, which are propaganda outfits, and that's how they should be treated. I don't think anyone in the Western world now doubts this. The coverage of the BBC, for instance, on these wars is effectively government propaganda, little more than that.
All right, Tariq Ali, Mideast expert, joining us live from London. Thank you very much for your analysis this hour.
Thank you.